Now, at the start of every Star Wars movie, you're told that what you're about to watch is something that actually happened a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And though it's highly, highly improbable, if not just plain silly to think, that Star Wars might actually be based on true stories, there's nevertheless plenty of fans, myself included, who have a deep love and passion for these stories, and see them as something akin to a modern day myth, and will, usually in good fun, argue the ins and outs of this galaxy, its characters and beliefs, as if debating and discussing real ancient history. And if you do want to operate under this belief that Star Wars is something real, again, in good fun, not because you truly believe, one would have to ask the question of how we have knowledge of this other galaxy at all, or perhaps I should say how George Lucas attained knowledge of it and was able to tell these stories in the first place, if they really are from so long ago and so far away. And oddly enough, there are actually two possible answers built right into the story itself. The first is the Journal of the Whills, from which the entire Star Wars saga is supposedly taken from. And if you're wondering who or what the Whills actually are, well, Lucas never gave a 100% definitive answer to that question, though they've always been thought of as essentially the gods of the Star Wars galaxy. Recently, however, Lucas said that his version of the sequel trilogy would have gotten into the microbiotic world, which is a different domain and the one the Whills inhabit, and that these creatures there operate differently from us and actually control the entire universe. And it's interesting to note that Lucas said universe and not galaxy, because if you really want to dive down the rabbit hole here, that would likely mean that the Whills control our galaxy as well, and that we too are a part of the Force, but for whatever reason, we cannot use it like those from that faraway galaxy once could. Anyway, before I get way too deep into this theory, if I haven't already, one interesting, albeit unlikely way the sequel trilogy could have ended is with a young George Lucas either somehow being presented with the actual Journal of the Whills by one of the Whills or some type of avatar of theirs perhaps, or maybe with him just being told the story of Star Wars by the last of the Whills, who wants this other galaxy to never be forgotten, while he sits there enthralled or maybe just trying to take some notes. And if the latter is the case, if Lucas himself never got his hands on the actual Journal of the Whills, well, it would explain some of the inconsistencies in his story at times, because he's not remembering it 100% accurately. This also then calls into question the accuracy and validity of the sequel trilogy entirely, which of course hasn't been written by Lucas, who knows the correct story from the Whills. But I'll get to more on that in just a moment. Because first I'd like to quickly touch on one other fun possibility as to how Lucas could have learned the story of Star Wars, and that is, as ridiculous as this is about to sound, he got it from R2-D2. In fact, that might even be alluded to right in the movie Revenge of the Sith, when Bail Organa very specifically says towards the end of the movie that only the protocol droid's memory is to be wiped. Meaning R2's memory, in theory, never has or will be erased, and why Lucas included this scene is actually very strange and head-scratching, because it implies R2 should have the events of the prequel trilogy stored in his memory banks, and for some reason, he never tells Luke, or anyone else for that matter, any of it during the events of the original trilogy. And sure, it's possible, maybe even likely considering the secretive nature of the rebellion, that R2's memory got wiped later down the road, before he ever meets Luke. But if that is the case, why did Lucas even bother including this scene about his memory not being wiped when Bail first takes possession of him? It seems pointless unless it does indeed imply his memory never would be erased while in the service of Bail Organa. In fact, all it seems to do is create inconsistencies between the two trilogies, since R2 would, obviously, know a great deal of information about Luke's father, not to mention the Jedi on the whole. He'd even know just who Obi-Wan Kenobi is when he's looking for him, yet when the two first meet in A New Hope, they seem to not recognize each other. And perhaps the only answer for this, to briefly get into another bizarre theory, is if off-screen or before the scene begins, Obi-Wan notices R2 hiding and tells him that he is never to tell Luke about his father or the Jedi, and to pretend, after Luke wakes up, that they don't know each other. And the odd part here is this is me trying to cover up a plot hole that Lucas seemed to have intentionally created for some reason. But I digress, and even though when you factor in the incredible distances between galaxies, it's unlikely, if not flat out impossible, R2 could have ever somehow, someway made his way to our galaxy and Earth in particular, not to mention still be intact and functional to some degree after so much time, Lucas apparently needlessly including that scene in Revenge of the Sith about his memory never being wiped, leaves the door open for a fun theory about R2 somehow making his way to Earth, and a young George Lucas somehow discovering him. And who knows, maybe all R2 had the power for was to show Lucas a hologram of a young princess needing the help of an Obi-Wan Kenobi, which spurred Lucas to create a story. And as mentioned earlier, what both these possibilities do, though especially the former about one of the Whills telling George Lucas the entire story of Star Wars or Skywalker saga, is call into question the accuracy and validity of the sequel trilogy, which has not been written by George Lucas, who knows the quote-unquote true story of Star Wars. In fact, we were told that his idea for the sequel trilogy was completely rejected. And oddly enough, there is even a scene in The Last Jedi that could be interpreted as Rian Johnson, J.J. Abrams, and Kathleen Kennedy acknowledging they are making up or telling an inaccurate story, that they are, in a sense, telling a story within a story, or playing make-believe in the real tale that was originally being told by George Lucas. And that, of course, is at the end of the movie, where we see two kids, a boy and a girl, being told a story by a third boy, and the only words we're able to make out from him are Luke Skywalker, Jedi Master. And this third boy could be a representation of J.J. Abrams, telling his ideas for Luke and the sequel trilogy, or maybe just telling the story of The Force Awakens, to Kathleen Kennedy and Rian Johnson. Then, of course, before he can finish telling the story, the Slave Master comes in and breaks it all up. And to even poke a bit of fun at us fans, the Slave Master could be a representation of Star Wars fans coming in after hearing the first part of the story and offering up their own theories as to how it should now end, which causes young Rian Johnson to scurry off and be bitter that he didn't get to hear the end of the story and to imagine up a different direction for that story that J.J. Abrams started that subverts all the fan expectations. And look, this theory is obviously supposed to be meant in good fun, but the strange thing is that the final scene of The Last Jedi could, one way or the other, be construed as a child literally telling the audience the whole movie, or the legend of Luke Skywalker according to just him. And that again, this whole thing has really just been a story within a story, and there's nothing to say he's getting it right or even telling it well. Even though, yes, I realize the scene is basically supposed to show how what Luke did on Crate has inspired a new generation, because apparently everyone forgot what he did 30 years ago. In closing here, I'd like to quote Obi-Wan from the scene in A New Hope, where he and everyone else aboard the Millennium Falcon are being pulled toward the Death Star, and he says to Han, "You can't win, but there are alternatives to fighting." And look, even though I personally didn't enjoy The Last Jedi, I don't want to fight with my fellow Star Wars fans who did. In fact, I'm genuinely happy some fans, maybe even a lot or most fans, love or at least accept that movie without question as part of the larger story started by George Lucas. Besides, I don't think there's anything I or anyone else could ever say or do that would change some people's minds or opinions about that movie. However, there certainly are a lot of fans who didn't enjoy it, or maybe haven't enjoyed anything Disney has done with Star Wars thus far, and to them I offer an alternative way to look at things, one that The Last Jedi, inadvertently most likely, may even offer evidence for, which is that modern Star Wars, without Lucas, is little more than people inserting themselves into the real story and trying to continue it with tales of their own. And that the real story of Star Wars, the one that, if you choose to believe the incredible, was once told to George Lucas by the Whills, will unfortunately never be fully told, or concluded with the Return of the Jedi, depending on how you want to look at it. And all us fans now have the choice to take or leave the Disney era of Star Wars, to think of it as we will. It can either be seen as a direct continuation of the story started by Lucas, or as people trying to play in his sandbox and, maybe from your point of view, not doing such a great job of it. Either way, despite the name of this franchise, I think we can all agree Star Wars was not created by Lucas, or told to him by the Whills or R2, to have people fight over it, but instead to be enjoyed and to, hopefully, inspire. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now I'd like to take a moment to thank Alex Hayden, both for supporting me on Patreon and for being the one who originally put this theory into my head and allowed me to run off with it to some pretty crazy places. And now I'd like to invite you all to tell me what you think about this theory and how you view the Disney version of Star Wars. And to ask, who does Star Wars really belong to? George Lucas, Disney, or the fans? And I'll be putting up a poll that asks this very question. So leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.